okay. I got mostly through lecture one last Sunday. Today we've got the balance of lecture one and as much of lecture two as possible. With luck, we'll finish lecture two and be up to 1500 and take up from there in lecture three next Sunday. And I do have some more devices that should help us pull things out this week, including this nice clicker here. So with that, let me get this started. Okay. Yes, I wound up the portion of lecture one that I did last week, talking largely about the church and church policies regarding Jews in Europe during the beginnings of Christianity into the Roman period in the Roman Empire. But now I'm going to focus on the state and the Jews, and specifically persecution by the state, the Roman state, east or west or both. Up into the later Roman period, where Emperor Constantine, those are the dates of his reign, who came to dominate both east and west, the eastern and the western Roman Empire during the first third of the 4th century. His mother was Christian. He himself had what he considered a miraculous vision just before battle, 306, that told him, in this sign conquer, and there were clouds in the shape of a cross in the sky. So but he dedicated himself to Christianity thereafter, although he didn't actually become baptized until he was on his deathbed in 337. But he always favored Christianity, literally throughout his long reign as emperor. And part of the way that he showed this was by persecuting the Jews of the empire. In 325, the same year that he called the famous Council of Nicaea, which I talked about last week, Constantine forbade Jews to proselytize, to seek converts. And that was not the only command he put forward that was problematical to the Jews, but that's the law I'm giving you now. In 357, his son and successor, Constantius, decreed that Christians who converted to Judaism would forfeit their property. He also moved to limit marriages between Jews and Christians, when by 400, the practice was totally forbidden. When Constantius became emperor in 337, he stated, "Let my will be religion." And that is what he lived by. In 392, or sometimes he's given us 393, but let's leave it at 392, there was an edict made by the emperor that declared the practice of all polytheistic faiths within the Roman Empire illegal. Judaism was not banned, Jewish practice was not banned, but there were many ways during the latter half of the 4th century that it was limited. And Jews were limited in what they could do. Were under an increasing number of legal penalties, and many of these were regularized, were standardized in a series of codifications of Roman law. Briefly, during the 6th century, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire, was known as the Byzantine Empire. The most important of all of these was the Justinian Code, enacted by the Emperor Constantine, who is pictured here in 529. And among other things, the Justinian Code prohibited Jews from building synagogues, from reading the Bible in Hebrew, and from testifying against Christians in court. Even banned the recital of Jewish prayers that were thought to go against the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. I mentioned these were mostly in the 6th century. However, they continued on and on and on. They were actually influential throughout the Middle Ages, up to the very close around 1500. So we're talking about an influence of 1,000 years or more. There is the Byzantine Empire, otherwise known as the East Roman Empire. And then, still less subtle, we find that it becomes more and more dangerous to be a Jew, because more and more states start demanding that the Jewish members of the population be baptized, be converted to Christianity. And by the way, one of the places where we especially find this is in the Byzantine Empire. A number of emperors made this demand of their Jewish subjects that they accept baptism. But was this also happening to theists, to those who worship pagan deities? The practice of these polytheistic faiths was illegal, whereas Judaism in and of itself was not. Jews were nevertheless being referred to, but what was really done with pagans more than with Jews was that there are all these missions that are being sent out. That's one thing that Pope Gregory the Great was well known for sending out these missions to try to convert the pagans. So the sense was that the pagans didn't know, and if they knew, that they wouldn't just naturally want to be Christian. The Jews were not given that leeway. There was a sense that the Jews were somehow refusing to accept Christianity. So that this seems to account for harsher treatment. With the pagans, it was more educated. So that explains the missions. But that is not to say there were never any orders given to force pagans to accept baptism. It certainly was not as common. In 628, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Heraclius, orders all Jews throughout his realm to be converted by force if necessary. Several other emperors offer similar edicts. Leo III follows suit in 722, and we know that in this case, it wasn't just an order being given. There was extreme persecution that followed. And we know this in part because some Jews did accept baptism, but a lot more simply committed suicide. Mass suicide, they burned themselves in their synagogues, that sort of thing, rather than be baptized. The Byzantine Empire remains a center for persecution, but also in Western Europe, the Visigothic states, Spain, would now be Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, and also France for a while. The Visigoths are really tough on the Jews after they themselves, and this is another rose case of moving from paganism to Christianity, and often when a ruler accepts Christianity, it becomes far less tolerant of the Jews. This happened with the Visigoths. So we find that the Visigothic ruler named Chilperic, an early acceptor of baptism, becoming a Christian, ordered many Jews to be baptized. This in 582, and received a number of them from the sacred font. In other words, he was actually there as they were being baptized. Some of them were purified in body only, however, not in heart, and lying to God, they returned to their former perfidy or treachery. This comes from a famous work of medieval chronicler. We're seeing here, we're mentioning again later, that once Jews had accepted baptism, even if it was in response to an order that if they weren't baptized, they would be killed or their eyes would be torn out, whatever. They could not go back. Could not simply say, well, look, I accepted baptism under tremendous duress. We're not allowed to go back. So we're seeing this complaint indicating many of them wanted to go back and couldn't. There's another problem for those Jews who agreed to be baptized. And after a while, notably, Spain, but also elsewhere, where Jews were under so much duress, or fairly large numbers of baptized Jews or conversos, or as they were known, the Anusim, the coerced ones. Basically, Jews absolutely did not have an easy choice. The Jewish authorities really felt that there was no way out. It was baptism or the sword. You took the sword. This is why we find so many Jews committing mass suicide for avoiding baptism. But for those who were baptized, who allowed themselves to be baptized, well, there was some sympathy for them as well. There were the Anusim, and this presented a problem to them, problem to the state, what to do about the Anusim. And we find in some states that there is an even greater pressure now to get rid of the Jews who are refusing to be baptized, because otherwise they're going to be encouraging those who accepted baptism, the conversos, to return to Judaism, to return to the community. And that would be a big issue and an incentive to get rid of the Jews one way or the other. Those who absolutely refuse to be baptized and be banished. And we do find this happening in the early Middle Ages, though we find it happening a lot more in the late Middle Ages. Canon statement from the Sixth Council of Toledo in Spain. The bishops were there saying thanks to the inspiration of God, the king, who was a man named Gentilla, another of those Visigoths. So the king, in union with the bishops of his kingdom, has chosen to obliterate Jewish practice and does not permit anyone who is not Catholic to reside in his kingdom. I would talk about the last years of the period I have covered, what it was like. We do find that years 800 to 1,000, there's something of a mixed picture. There are moderate rulers. One of them is the most famous ruler by far in this period, in which the great empire centered on what would become France, mounting into Germany, Italy, etc. This was King Charlemagne, who was crowned as emperor in 800. In this slide, this image shows that scene of him kneeling and receiving while being crowned by the Pope. There were legal difficulties for Jews in the Carolingian Empire. They were under disadvantages, had to plead in court, or if they needed to bring a case or were sued for something in court. They were under limitations, but nevertheless, by and large, he was very moderate toward the Jews. And one thing that he did allow them was reasonable freedom to be involved in mercantile activities, to trade. He was fairly modern in that. He also, and we'll see this is kind of a big deal, he also did have some Jews who had offices at his court or in his government. And there were other rulers that we find who were moderate as well during this time period. Should also note, we've been talking a lot about what the Christians are doing to the Jews, or through the church or through the state. How are the Jews reacting? Well, as you might imagine, often very negatively. We see this reflected in two sets of works that are quite common in this period, not that they don't exist in other periods, noteworthy in this last phase of the early Middle Ages. There are apologetics and there are polemics. These are often works written by Jewish scholars. They're generally in Hebrew, which is intended to kind of limit them to Jewish audience. They are apologetics, which are basically encouragements given to Jews to resist baptism absolutely. It's to explain why Judaism is the great religion and why they should stay in it. Those are apologetics. And then there are polemics, which are primarily attacks on Christianity on the behavior of Christians. And of course, they tend to be angry. And yes, we do find these, and we don't find them just in the period 800 to 1000, but there just seem to be a lot during that time. I thought I'd pick a very interesting example of one who advanced this anger. His name was Bodo. And Bodo was not by any means born a Jew. He was a Christian. He became an important Briton. No one's quite sure just how high he went, but he was a major church figure, court of Charlemagne's son. He may have been a bishop. He's pretty high up there. But in 838, he suddenly told the king that he had to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And he stopped in Spain, was converted to Judaism, married a Jewish woman, and launched into a series of attacks against Christianity and the fact that Christians had persecuted the Jews so horribly. A series of letters written to a Christian. It's not known whether this Christian had been Jewish and had been baptized. In any case, they argue a lot. We don't have any of Bodo's original letters. We have the versions of them given by the man who claimed that he was writing them to him, and that this had gone back and forth. It's something like Appian, Josephus. We have only one side. According to these letters passed down to us, Bodo said, given the way the Christians have treated Jews, they should be treated the same way. By the time he was writing this, Spain was under the hold of Muslims. He'd been invaded about 100 years before. It was now a Muslim kingdom. And he said, the the Muslims in power, they should persecute the Christians, just as the Christians have persecuted Jews for so long. So there was a lot of anger there. However, as for what the Jews themselves were doing in terms of, I guess we can say, fighting back, they realized that they had, practically speaking, virtually no power. They could not rise up, even as they had risen several times under Roman rule. They couldn't do that. It would have been flat-out suicide. And they knew this. Then what we generally find in this phase of history, 800 to 1,000, is that the Jews are at least outwardly quiet. They may be exchanging angry polemics among themselves, but they're not really challenging Christians. In most of Europe, they are already a very small minority, maybe 2% of the population. Christians have totally taken over. I know all but a few Cretan kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. We find Jews just following hard and not fighting back or yelling back. Don't proselytize. They don't interact with the Christian community all that much. So, freedom, Christian control, Jewish passivity. And with that, I'm going to wind up this lecture and get into the next lecture, which by coincidence is going to be entitled Lecture 2. Antisemitism becomes endemic, 1500. Then, right away, you're going to see this theme that the Jews are caught between two worlds at this time. We've talked about the Christian one. Of course, there was also the Islamic one. And this map shows you the great caliphate dominated by Islam. This the 9th centuries, the Common Era. With it, and then you can see it extending in the west beyond the caliphate into the Iberian Peninsula. But it doesn't really change that dramatically after this, except that in 1453, of course, you have the conquest of the rest of the Byzantine Empire. Followed Constantinople was in 1453, and then they continue moving up as late as 1683. They are besieging, though not taking, Vienna, so that gives you an idea of how far they went. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Islam now. But it's not that easy to say, well, if it was so tough for the Jews in Europe, why didn't they get out? Why didn't they go to Africa? There were difficulties in the Muslim world as well. Maimonides, he was born in Spain, a section of Spain that was controlled by the Muslims. This is something that is not known, definitely. But he says that he and his family were endangered by Muslim mobs. What is unclear is whether he himself technically accepted Islam, whether he converted so we could get out of there and go find security. He, in any case, went into North Africa. Okay. So let's talk about early Islam and the dangers it presented. Muhammad became attracted to monotheism primarily through the Jewish merchants and traders that he came into contact with, Arabian, and he started thinking in terms of no, you're that, yes, would be influenced by Judaism, but would go beyond it. And in his early teaching, there is much that is positive about Judaism. For example, Muslims, when they pray, are supposed to pray toward Jerusalem. And he imagined that as Jews got to know his Reformed faith, he would all convert to it. They would become Muslims. When they didn't, angry. He changed his teaching that Muslims were supposed to pray not in the direction of Jerusalem, but rather in the direction of Mecca, which is what still obtains. There was also some violence against Jews living in the Arabian Peninsula. Most notably, there were several Jewish tribes, and one of them was especially important. It was called the Banu Qurayza. They became involved in a war with an army of all Muhammad. They were defeated in a major battle outside Medina, and the men in the tribe were all sentenced to death. The judge said Muhammad had appointed with their case. Muhammad himself approved that ruling, and according to statements, the sources we have, between 600 and 800 men were executed. The women and children were sold into slavery. So there was certainly some violence. I suppose more important to note statements in the Quran, and I'm by no means giving all of them, and it would be problematical for the Jew. Quote, Muslims shall surely find the most violent of all men an enmity against the true believers to be the Jews and the idolaters. And when a book, the Quran, came unto them from God, confirming the scriptures which were with them, although they had prayed for assistance against those who believed not, yet when that came unto them, which they knew to be from God, they would not believe therein. Therefore the curse of God shall be on the infidels. Islam became first the faith of the Arabian Peninsula, and then it would move out and out and out and out. And we do find this case, as we find in Europe, in pattern cases of extreme violence against Jews who would not accept Islam in this case, but also a degree of acceptance. Jews and Christians were legally tolerated in Islam and so-called people of the book, Endemic. And in about 1640, an early caliph, a very, very important figure in early Islamic history, Umar, this is Umar the Great, conquers the Persian Empire. He's the great conqueror in this early phase of Islam. He reaches a covenant with the Jews, kind of setting out what they must do. Jews would be allowed to practice Judaism, but could not build new synagogues. Their services had to be hushed. Jews were not allowed to ride horses because that made them look haughty and literally above the common population. They were not supposed to be that way. Jews were required to pay Muslims respect. And finally, they were required to pay a pretty hefty tribute or tax each year. Even this did all these things and didn't do what they weren't supposed to do. Didn't move around peacefully and be tolerated. So we have this covenant of Omar around 100 years later, there would be another caliph named Omar. And there would be a code. So we have the covenant of Omar, we have the code of Omar. They say pretty much the same thing, but there are the two different documents. But what about back to the persecution? I said that the Jews were tolerated. That doesn't mean that they have limitations be put on them. There were actually a lot. One of the interesting ones was from the year 807, when a caliph named al-Rashid orders Jews to wear a yellow belt. And by the way, orders Christians wear a blue belt. Okay, we've all seen photos of Jews during World War II in Nazi-occupied Europe, and actually in, here is it for not Nazi-occupied, that they had to wear their yellow stars of David. That was Jewish bad time. Well, there have been Jewish badges of one kind or another, ways of identifying Jews by their costume for more than 1,000 years. Not at every moment, but it was really quite an old tradition. This is the first one. 807, first time that we find Jews being required to dress distinctively. But people will know that they are Jews. And sometimes the caliphs were violent. In the 11th century, the early 11th century, a caliph named Al-Hakim, Hakim, tried to force the Jews in his domain to accept Islam. When the by and large refused, he ordered the destruction of the Jewish quarter in Cairo, and then later he expelled all of the Jews from his domain. In Morocco, in 1033, there's a set of anti-Jewish riots. We read estimates of 6,000 Jews killed. In Granada, Spain, in 1066, riots again, 4,000 Jews reported killed. And then there are the Almohads. They are a people originating in northwestern Africa who moved up into the Iberian Peninsula, and they start attacking Jews and Christians there. Tremendous amount of violence that lasts for quite a while, and undoubtedly significant numbers of Jews were killed in these assaults. So yes, there was certainly mob violence, and that would continue to be a problem in the Islamic world. It was not just in the Christian world. But anyway, I'm going to go back into Christian Europe now. Let's talk about Crusade. The First Crusade to wrest Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims that had controlled it for more than 400 years. In 1095, the church launches the First Crusade. It could also be far and away the most successful from a Christian point of view. Jerusalem would be taken, the Holy Land, or certainly most of it, would be taken. There was even a whole small state set up that actually became divided later, so there were two Christian states in this area, and that would last, or it would be shrinking until 1291, so almost 200 years. The First Crusade was not only, well, it was the most successful from a Christian point of view, it was the most deadly from the Jewish point of view. By far. It is estimated that between 10,000 and 20,000 Jews were killed by mobs and by Crusader-led armies, and I can put armies in quotation marks. They were really largely mobs. You have many assaults on the Jews. Largest number and the most violent in Germany, Rhine Valley. You have Crusader armies that are really in no hurry to get to the Holy Land. They find that it's so much more profitable for them to plunder the wealth of the Jews. The most notorious of those attacking the Jews was a man named Emeritus of History. Endemic was responsible for, among other things, killing of about 500 Jews in the German city of Worms. And with such pattern, there would be many other episodes of violence associated with crusades. During the Third Crusade, a famous case in War, kind of due north of London, where several hundred Jews were trapped in a tower and committed suicide rather than be killed or forced to accept baptism. There were also crusaders who never actually went to the Holy Land, but they said they would, they just didn't. A group of crusaders, non-Jew, France, 1236, attacked local Jews, who gave them the order of baptism or death. 500 of them accepted baptism. 3,000 of them were murdered. Including Kate. You already have. And many of them were trampled under the horses' hooves. Okay, so crusading period is very violent. And I'll have a little bit more to say about this later. Now let's talk about Jews in the church. Talk about the papacy first. We're going to divide this up into different elements of the clergy. Starting during the 12th century, and inspired by these acts of violence against the Jews associated with crusades, we find one of the popes and then others and others and others issuing a papal bull, papal document. This one is called Sicut Judaeus, meaning as for the Jews. And the words were taken from a letter that Gregory the Great had sent out, ordering that the Jews not be harmed, they not be forced to convert, really moderate stuff. But Jews had their rights too. Okay, basically, Sicut Judaeus is inspired by this letter from Gregory, and it says the same thing. The Jews are not to be harmed, they're not to be pressured into accepting baptism. And Sicut Judaeus winds up being issued by well over a dozen medieval popes. In fact, really, most of the popes, when they become popes, they renew it. It's issued in their name, and so it goes. That doesn't mean that they are all wildly sympathetic toward the Jews, because some very anti-Semitic popes also issue Sicut Judaeus, including, this is perhaps, is often regarded as the apogee of the medieval papacy, the most powerful pope of them all. This is Innocent III, got his state sovereign there. He's an important figure, yeah. But as you can tell from this statement, very hostile to the Jews. Jews like the fratricide Cain, and note again that association of the Jews with Cain. I talked about that last week. The fratricide Cain are doomed to wander about the earth as fugitives and vagabonds, and their faces must be covered with shame. They are under no circumstances to be protected by Christian princes, but on the contrary to be condemned to serfdom. Yet this was a pope who did issue secret edicts. I'll include, I might say there seems to be a bit of inconsistency here, but it is fair to say, though, not even innocent, is saying the Jews are horrible people, let's kill them all. No, you're not going to find any pope ever saying that. But on the other hand, the Jews being severely persecuted, that they be impoverished, well, you find another pope saying that, and here is one of them, a very important one. And I've also mentioned Gregory the Ninth here, who was pope from 1227 to 1241. And Gregory the Ninth is important in general for establishing the papal inquisition, which is against heresy, what would wind up catching up and accuse many converso Jews. He tried, he ordered that Christians not even converse with Jews. They were to be entirely separated. He also encouraged the burning of the Talmud. Well, this was a big deal back in the 13th century. Thousands of copies of the Talmud, and we're talking about a huge document here, were consigned to the flames, most notably in France. But he too issued Vicot Judaeus. Gregory and later popes, by the way, also ordered disputations that Jews would have to attend, where there would be a few Jewish scholars confronted by Christian scholars, clergy, and they would argue the points of Judaism and Christianity, except, first of all, the Christians could attack Judaism all they wanted to. The Jews were not allowed to even by implication, criticize Christianity. And usually the judge of this debate would be someone like a prince or a nobleman he would his rule with very few exceptions that the Christians won the argument and the Jews should convert to Christianity. But, I do like to give two sides of the story when I can. So I'm now going to be doing that. This is Pope Martin V, and he is another very important pope. He is responsible in church history for having brought the church back together after a period of it being divided along various fissure lines. Very important church figure. So the scene here, it says, blesses the delegation of Jews. He did that, but also he accepted as gifts from these Jews a number of Torah scrolls. It became common in the 15th century that when there was a new pope, a delegation of Jews would show up with some Torah scrolls and other religious writings and hand them over as a gift, and which is significant. The Jews are reaching out. They're kind of trying to win friends. And that's an important issue in Jewish history. This is an early case of that. But also, Let's read a statement that Mark Ray. Christians forfeited their right to be called such when they did everything in their power to oppress the Jews. Jews are created like other men in the image of God, and in order to protect their future, they must not be molested in their synagogues nor hindered in their commercial relations with Christians. I might mention that this is in a document where Martin basically tries to upgrade the freedom of Jews who are associated, as he says, with commerce, with banking, etc., but certainly friendly to the Jews. Okay, anyway, let's talk about different time periods. We know five popes and clusters who are more hostile to the Jews, and sometimes more friendly than Jews get. Runs in cycles. Okay, let's go on and talk about the prelates. Those who are not popes but ranked very high in the church hierarchy. We often find these men, bishops, archbishops, abbots, especially of major monasteries, who do their best to protect the Jews. Like the Bishop of Speyer, Germany, during the First Crusade, who gives orders. There are mobs attacking the Jews of Speyer. He gives orders to all the local constabulary, etc., to protect the Jews. They are protected. The number who wind up being killed comparatively small. We find many, many cases like this of bishop or archbishop who gives orders to protect Jews, and the Jews are protected. Another prelate, this man. This is Bernard of Clairvaux. He was sometimes regarded as the uncrowned pope. He was tremendously important. Then with him, as with so many other important church figures who were sort of friendly to the Jews, or at least moderate, he wrote some very nasty things. He believed a lot of charges against Jews, a lot of the legends, a lot of the myths. He was not willing to see them be victimized by violence. And before he did, we'll need to go down a level, get into the lower clergy, or the middle echelon, and often you do find the clergy who are stirring up mobs to go attack the Jews. When one of these was a man named Rudolph. He was a monk, and during the Second Crusade, during the 1140s, he went around, again, it was mainly in Germany, mainly the Rhineland, preaching against the Jews, stirring up mobs. There was some violence, not on the order of the violence during the First Crusade, but still Jews being killed. And one of his stops, who should confront him but Bernard of Clairvaux, was miles higher than he was in terms of his ranking. And he ordered him to shut up and go back to his monastery. Rudolph did that. Was never heard from again. We often find that the prelates who are helpful, in any case, they Even if they don't like the Jews, they're not going to support violence against them. But you move down another level, you get to the friars. The friars were very different. Were definitely, in terms of anti-Semitism, very much part of the problem. There were two main orders of friars in the Middle Ages. Well, after the early 13th century, there are the Dominicans and the Franciscans. And unlike the monks, who were largely tied to monasteries, was the job of the friars to be out in the open, preaching. So their role was very different. Level the monks. Anyway, one of the friars who was important, and whose name is still remembered, is this man. This, even though he was actually an Italian, he's remembered by the Spanish version of his name, Juan de Capistrano. He was a Franciscan friar. He was famous for his hatred of the Jews, and for his sermons against them was often called Scourge of the Jews, although there were lots of scourges of the Jews, for what he's called that, and in a kind of positive way. Notably, he was sent into Poland by the Pope mid-15th century to sermonize, specifically about the Jews, but he wound up sermonizing mainly about the Jews. Poland was having difficulties militarily, etc., etc., etc. And he told his audiences that God was angry at Poland because the Jews were there and they were doing so well. So he was getting vengeance on Poland because the Jews were being treated well. Anyway, Polish mobs attacked the Jews. As regarded his attitude toward Jews, he made no bones about it. He goes, "Common like here, foreign." To fight the Jew was a duty of the Catholic, not a choice. So, yeah, the friars are a big problem. One of the biggest within the various ranks of the clergy. There is also lay zealots, individuals who thought they had a special calling, even if they weren't in holy orders, even if they weren't actual clergy, but nevertheless would sermonize and would preach and would often counsel violence against the Jews. I talked about the Crusades earlier. There were only 8 official crusades that were ordered by the church itself. However, there were many, many more quasi-crusades that were organized on other levels. They all had the same supposed target. They were all aiming to go to the Middle East and help David for Christianity. But there were many crusades that were sort of lower class in terms of those who participated, were not knights. And they might talk about going down to Jerusalem, but they knew they weren't going. So they decided to attack those whom they regarded as enemies of Christianity and of the church close to home, and they attacked the Jews. This is a common case. The issue is really how many Jews there are, and how large this group of would-be crusaders is. So we have in 1320 and 1321 the Crusade of the Shepherds, And the name kind of gives it away. This was a lower class thing. This was not a churchy cruel crusade. So the shepherds pretty much right away go after the Jews, first in Western France, led on into Spain, and they attacked them many times. Estimates have it that they wiped out 120 Jewish communities in France and Spain, most notably at Verdun in northern France. They besieged 500 Jews in the tower. The adult Jews commit suicide rather than accept baptism. Their children, the ones who were left behind, are then baptized. So there's a lot of violence, and this is really an extension of mob violence. And then there were the flagella. Characteristically, well, they were most associated with the Black Death. Obviously, these are going horribly. They would join processions headed by usually a lay preacher. They were convinced that they had somehow, or humankind had committed horrible sins, and they had to somehow do their penance for that. So they would pray a lot. Well, they would whip themselves. We see that here. Or others. That's why they were called the flagellants. And they would frequently attack Jews, because the one who was delivering the sermon would say that that's what they should do. In 1349, Mainz, Western Germany, when there was a large force of flagellants moving toward the city, they begged the local authorities to keep them out. They did their best, but the flagellants were able to break in and slaughter Jews. The contemporary sources speak of 12,000 Jews being massacred at Mainz in 1349. As always, so mixed bag. You find some rulers who protect the Jews, or this one, and some very important names. Here's maybe the most famous of all, Jews. In the first of England, otherwise known as William the Conqueror. The England that he conquered, he was the Duke of Normandy in northwestern France. Anyway, the England that he conquered had very few Jews and no real Jewish community. But there were lots of Jews in France, including in Normandy, and he encouraged them to go to England. And the usual interpretation is that he needed an immediate middle class, and that's what the Jews would bring. They would bring know-how in finance, in money lending, in banking. They would make the English economy more up-to-date, successful. Anyway, he did bring them into England. The medieval English Jewish community begins with him. And then there is Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor. I mentioned that he was behind the counterattack that brought the destruction of that army headed by Endemic of Leyden. But in general, he showed a lot of sympathy toward the Jews. He was, and this is very unusual, there were some Jews who had accepted baptism literally at sword point. He told them if they wanted to, they could go back to being Jewish. This was virtually unheard of. The rulers didn't like it, but the church, even the most liberal of the popes, would have said, no, they can't undo your baptism. Once you're baptized, or Christian, then go back to being Jewish. Lord Henry IV was one of the few who did permit this. So, yeah, we can talk about some synthetic rulers. They're mostly fairly early, though. They're like 11th, the 12th century. It starts going downhill in the later Middle Ages. And there are a number of developments that are problematic. Even when there were some who were comparatively sympathetic toward the Jews, the Jews were always lower caste in terms of their political rights, their ability to defend themselves legally. I'll put it that way. They were sometimes defined as the king's treasure, meaning his treasury, meaning that he didn't have to worry about getting the permission of some parliamentary type body to tax them, for just take as much money from them as he wanted. It was like opening a box that was full of cash and taking out a whole lot. They were sometimes defined as a treasury. And we can see this interestingly. In case of a man named Aaron, who lived in the city of Lincoln, quarter that is often called Aaron of Lincoln's house, though it looks today. There are, by the way, those who say, well, this isn't Aaron of Lincoln's house. Another house, of which something like this one is the real Aaron of Lincoln's house. But anyway, he was not merely the wealthiest Jew in England during the 12th century. He was, aside from the king, quite possibly the wealthiest man in England. Big money lender, big banker, banks in several counties. But he was still a Jew. When he died in 1186, his children didn't inherit his fortune. The king's victims took it to authority with all statements about men who owed him money, of his wealth. It was such a great amount that there is still a branch in the exchequer that is something like the Royal Treasury in England, the money associated with Aaron of Lincoln. This was the sort of thing that a king could do. He had the power to lay huge fines on individual Jews or Jewish communities. He needed money. He could, depending on the circumstance, he could do pretty much what he wanted. And that meant that a very wealthy Jewish community today could be a very impoverished Jewish community tomorrow. And then there were the monarchs who flat out persecuted the Jews. The crown, that is Philip IV, otherwise known as Philip Augustus, because his conquest kind of rounded out France, changed the French map. But as far as the Jews go, in 1191, his army seized the city of Rye, and Philip ordered that the Jews there choose between conversion or death. Some accepted baptism, others refused, and about 100 of them were burnt at the stake. And then there is one whose name would be more familiar to you. This is King Louis IX, otherwise known as St. Louis, the one out in Corvallis city. is named. He is boarding a ship in 1270 on the second of two crusades that he organized. These were not church crusades. These were Louis' crusades, which he financed. He went on, and in this case, he died on in 1270. He had a long reign, and he was pretty openly hostile to the Jews, persecuted them a lot, burned many, many, many sets of the Talmud, among other things. At one point, banished the Jews from France, but he then rescinded that. One of his contemporary chroniclers at one point addressed the Jewish community of France. Yeah, the King of France hates you and persecutes you. And this was all true. And with these two men, Augustus with Louis IX, we see a hugely successful and one of the largest Jewish communities in all of Europe. How in one way down, move toward the later Middle Ages. The Papal Inquisition was still set up, goes on through the realms of the Middle Ages. But there are also national inquisitions set up, including far and away most famously the Spanish Inquisition. And it by the way, lasted until well into the 19th century. It didn't cut its stores until the 1830s. Like it was actually founded in the 1470s. Okay, so you got inquisitions. And by the way, Jews, one of the big deals about getting them baptized was that the second were baptized, you were under the authority of the Inquisition. The Inquisition could come after you. It could not come after unbaptized Jews, however much it wanted to. It could go after conversos, and the conversos were very heavily persecuted. Many thousands of them were sent to their deaths, were usually burnt at the stake. Or after the Inquisition, ruled that they were violating their oath to Christianity. And they were apostates. By the way, the Spanish Inquisition was sent all over the Spanish Empire. They also have it active in New Spain or Mexico, 18th century, and conversos there are burnt at the stake, and etc. The Philippines goes around. Okay, we also have to watch out about mob rule. Often, regardless of attempts to protect the Jews, it just isn't enough. There is one case in the city of Mainz, which I've already referred to. This is 1096, associated with the First Crusade. In this case, the Bishop of Mainz had offered protection to the Jews of Mainz inside his palace. But then a mob came mob attacked the Jews in the hall with arrows and lances. Breaking the bolts and doors, they killed the Jews, about 700 in number, who in vain resisted the force and attack of so many thousands. They killed the women also, and with their swords pierced tender children of whatever age or sex. We do read, though, also about those who tried to protect the Jews. I talked about local constabularies. But it may have gone beyond that. All Jews did have their friends. Usually, if they were living in the city, as almost all of them were, they would have. There would be their neighbors who were Christian and friendly with them. We do find an interesting case also associated with the First Crusade, where the city of Cologne is attacked by a mob. Some Jews are killed, but very few. And historians have suggested the reason is that others were being protected by their neighbors, by Christian friends. I'm going to talk a bit about when danger was the greatest. In a time of rising religious fervor, certainly you talked about the association of many acts of violence with the Crusades. It was the only case where there was rising religious fervor. It's obvious. Here's the proclamation of the First Crusade in 1094. But also, these are themes I'm going to be talking about several times later. When there is rising nationalism, we really have to look out for nationalism. It has often been a key problem. I'm going to go back to the Middle Ages on this one. Here we have the Iberian Peninsula, circa 1200. In a book published in 1954 by a very noted Spanish historian named Domenico Castro, and the book entitled The Structure of Spanish History, he pondered the question of why, on the one hand, as was true, you have this extraordinarily large and successful Jewish community in Spain during the Middle Ages. But then why did Spain in the 14th and 15th centuries turn more and more toward violence against the Jews and the Muslims, by the way? And why did the crown turn more hostile? And finally, in 1492, the Jews were given the choice between baptism and banishment. Most of them chose banishment. But okay, why did this happen? And he thought what was happening was that the Spanish Christians were becoming more and more fervent in their faith and came to believe that they were the primary defenders of Christianity and of the church. Therefore, it was their job to wreak the power of, or perhaps to kill, or at least expel, somehow break any influence of those whom they regarded as being the enemies of Christianity, Muslims and particularly Jews. So that's why you see this pattern. It comes back into wedding of nationalism and religion. People trying to define what is our role as a nation. See, this is often a problem in history, has a lot to do with anti-Semitism. Also, for a power vacuum. Even if a ruler is notably anti-Semitic, he seldom is going to just ignore if Jews are being attacked by mobs, or frankly, if there's a lot of violence against the Jews. He's going to do something about it. That takes us to about 1370s in the first place. In southern Spain, there is a deacon, Jewish figure, named Pavan Martinez. He starts launching verbal assaults against the Jews, stirs up mobs against them, especially in the city of Seville. The Jews in Seville plead for assistance against him, and he is finally ordered out by the Archbishop of Seville. and leaves. But years later, the Archbishop dies. Also, he then dies, and there is a power vacuum. And who should become the acting Archbishop of Seville but Martinez? He goes right back with these vitriolic sermons against the Jews, and soon there are Jewish communities all around southern, southeastern Spain, and then later more and more Spain, all being attacked, all being threatened with death or baptism. This would set in a century of violence against the Jews of Spain. The collapse of this great Spanish Jewish community. Okay, in a circumstance where there is calamity of some sort, and Jews are blamed for it, I'm going to give you a great example. The circumstance of wealth, poverty, and weakness. Really, whether there's wealth or there's poverty, it can be dangerous for the Jews. If there's a lot of wealth, and a lot of people want to steal that wealth. You have mobs plundering Jewish homes, etc. It's poverty, then they can't afford, frankly, bribes to persuade local forces, constabulary forces to protect them. If they're politically weak, which also ties in with their wealth, who may not be on the king's good side, etc. Okay, you find many riots against them that are actually led by people who owe money to Jewish moneylenders, like Richard Malavasi, a nobleman who led that assault on the Jews in York, in England, and I'm going to be one. The Jews in England continued to do fairly well until later in the century, late in the 13th century, when Edward I, a very important English king, is king. And he really turns on the Jewish community. First, he tells them that they can no longer lend money. It really harms their economy and rations. And then, in 1290, he banishes the Jews from England. This is the first of the national level banishments of Jews. It would set off a pattern of this in the late Middle Ages. Finally, I'll mention Louis the Rich. He is the Duke of Bavaria in southern Germany in the middle of the 15th century. And he has all the Jews in Bavaria doesn't release them until they pay a huge fine. And then he expels them. Not only did he do this, but he sent out a circular letter to other rulers in Germany saying, I did this, you can do it too. Okay, well, on that note, I will wind up for today. I'll wind up this lecture next Sunday, and eventually, I promise we will get caught up. Not today. There's still so much stuff in the Middle Ages. We haven't even gotten to the issue of why the Jews have whores. We'll be doing that next Sunday.